Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story from 1856 Louisiana about the widow who turned her husband into a feast for the slaves. A tale you might have never heard before, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The air on the Dilroy plantation in the summer of 1856 was a physical presence, a thick, wet blanket woven from heat, humidity, and the unshed tears of generations. It was an atmosphere that suffocated sound, pressing down upon the land with a weight that felt ancient and alive. On the night, Edmund Dilroy's heart finally surrendered to a lifetime of bourbon and bile. The very world seemed to hold its breath. The chirping of the crickets, usually a deafening electric chorus in the Louisiana heat, had fallen into an unnerving silence. The whisper of the wind through the ancient, moss-draped oaks, a sound that was the plantation's constant. Mournful lullaby had ceased. This was a silence that was not peaceful. It was predatory. It was the charged stillness of a hunting ground, as if the land itself, a long-suffering witness, was waiting for a signal, a final, definitive release from a pressure it had borne for decades. Inside the grand house, a gleaming white monument to stolen wealth and concealed misery. The lanterns flickered weakly, their golden glow, meant to signify warmth and civilization, struggled against the oppressive, encroaching darkness. They cast long dancing shadows that warped the familiar shapes of ornate French furniture and heavy velvet curtains into monstrous, skeletal forms. The home, once a theater of clinking glasses, brittle laughter, and the sharp whip crack of a master's command, now sat like a mausoleum awaiting its primary occupant. Its windows were dark, hollow eyes staring out into the starless night. Its corridors, once echoing with the hurried, fearful steps of servants, were abandoned and utterly still. In the main parlor, surrounded by the suffocatingly sweet scent of wilting magnolias, Lucille Dilroy sat perfectly upright in a high-backed, crimson chair. Her hands, pale and slender, rested calmly in the lap of her black silk morning dress. She was a statue, carved from alabaster and shadow, a fixed point in a world that had just been irrevocably altered. There was no tremble in her fingers, no redness rimming her cold, unnervingly clear eyes. For a woman whose husband of 2 decades lay cooling in a coffin in the adjacent room, her composure was not just remarkable, it was unnatural. It was supernatural. The face of the widow was a portrait of profound, almost divine serenity, the kind of placid calm that only settles after years of silence. Helpless rage have finally burned themselves out, leaving behind nothing but a core of ice and ash. Earlier that day, a procession of neighbors had arrived in their carriages, their faces carefully arranged into masks of solemnity. Women like Mrs. Beauregard, the wife of a neighboring cotton baron, had offered their condolences in hushed, perfumed whispers, pressing Lucille's hand while their eyes darted around the room, hungry for details, for the slightest crack in the widow's facade. "Such strength, my dear Lucille," Mrs. Beauregard had murmured, her voice a theatrical sigh. "To bear such a sudden loss with such fortitude." They saw her stillness and mistook it for resilience. They saw her silence and called it dignity. They were wrong. What they witnessed was not the strength to endure grief, but the chilling emptiness that follows the completion of a long and terrible task. The battle was over. The rage had found its final, silent expression. The death of Edmund Dilroy, the titan of this decaying empire, was not an end. For Lucille, and for the souls who toiled under his brutal reign, it was a genesis, a haunting, terrible, and meticulously planned beginning. But this serenity, this chilling placidity that baffled her peers, was not born in a day. It was a pearl cultivated over 20 years, formed layer by painful layer around a single grain of exquisite suffering. It was forged in the crucible of the Dilroy Plantation, a corner of St. Landry Parish where hell had taken root in the fertile Mississippi Delta soil. To understand the silence of the widow, one must first understand the ceaseless, grinding noise of the world she inhabited. Antebellum Louisiana was a kingdom built on a foundation of elegant, brutal paradoxes, exquisite beauty, and unimaginable cruelty. Declarations of pious faith and the most godless of daily acts. A rigid code of honor that shielded the most dishonorable of men. The plantation itself was a perfect microcosm of this grand contradiction. From the oak-lined avenue, the main house was an architectural jewel, its white Doric columns rising proudly, a testament to order and prosperity against the chaotic green of the sugarcane fields. Its gardens were a painter's dream, a riot of azaleas, camellias, and jasmine, their perfume a constant, intoxicating presence designed to enchant visitors and project an image of idyllic southern grace. This was a beautiful, meticulously crafted lie. The beauty was a thin, fragile veneer masking a relentless machine of human suffering. The well that funded the crystal chandeliers, the imported mahogany, and Lucille's own silk gowns was extracted from the broken backs and shackled limbs of the 83 enslaved men, women, and children who lived and died on Dilroy land. Every acre of the estate, from the manicured lawns to the sprawling cane fields, was drenched in generations of sweat, blood, and unspoken sorrow. Parish records from the 1850s speak of men like Edmund Dilroy with a certain detached reverence, noting their economic contributions, their land holdings, and their influence in local politics. What these sanitized ink and paper ledgers fail to capture is the reality of their power. A power that, in its remote, rural context, was more absolute than that of any European king. Within the borders of his land, the master was a monarch. His whims were the law. His moods were the weather that governed the lives of all beneath him. His authority, sanctioned by Louisiana's infamous Code Noir and bolstered by a society that viewed his dominion as natural and just, was terrifyingly intimate. It extended not only to the bodies of those he owned to be worked, beaten, sold, or violated as he saw fit, but to the very soul of the woman he had married. Edmund Dilroy was a man whose cruelty was not a strategic tool for managing his property, but a form of daily recreation. He was a connoisseur of fear, a glutton for subservience. He derived a visceral, almost sexual, pleasure from the tremble of a servant's hand, the averted gaze of a field worker, or the quiet, barely perceptible flinch of his own wife. The atmosphere he cultivated was one of constant, low-grade terror, where a misspoken word, a dropped blight, or an unsatisfactory meal could result in consequences that scarred both flesh and memory. The land itself seemed to have absorbed this sustained malice. The shadows beneath the oaks felt colder. Even in the blistering summer heat, the waters of the bayou that snaked along the property's edge seemed darker, more sluggish. The very soil, rich and black, felt heavy with the weight of buried secrets and unavenged sins. It was a place where justice was a foreign concept, a word read from the pulpit on Sundays but never witnessed on a Monday. In such a world, a closed system of absolute power where the avenues of law and society are permanently barred. Grievances do not simply disappear. They fester, they curdle, they turn inward, seeking new, darker, more elemental channels through which to flow. So they seek a different kind of balance, a different kind of justice. Into this world, this theater of casual cruelty and performative gentility, two women were cast into orbits of pain. Their social stations were worlds apart, one the mistress of the house, the other its property, but their suffering emanated from the same source. Their paths, for years running parallel in silent observation, were destined to finally, fatefully, collide in the oppressive, aromatic quiet of the plantation kitchen. Lucille was not born with iron in her spine. It was forged in her there, piece by piece, in the fires of humiliation. She arrived at the Dilroy plantation at the tender age of 17, a delicate southern belle from a respectable but financially ruined Creole family in New Orleans. Her mind was filled with the romantic novels she had devoured in the convent school, her heart with the vague, hopeful expectation of a life of comfort and social standing. Her marriage was not a union of hearts or even of interests. It was a transaction, cold and simple. Her father, a man with a genteel name and a ruinous taste for cards, had traded his daughter's future for a ledger wiped clean. Her illusions were shattered on her wedding night. The man who awaited her, Edmund Dilroy, was a man whose charm was a weapon, deployed in public and discarded in private. Behind the closed doors of the master's bedroom, Lucille learned that the vows of love and cherish spoken in the St. Louis Cathedral had no currency on his land. At first, the very walls of the mansion became her only witnesses. They absorbed her muffled sobs into their thick plaster. They bore silent testimony to the bruises that blossomed on her arms and back like grotesque purple flowers, bruises she learned to hide with long sleeves and high-collared dresses. The indifferent, gilded mirrors reflected back a face that grew paler, thinner, and older with each passing month. The naive, hopeful girl who had arrived dreaming of love was systematically, cruelly dismantled. Her spirit was eroded day by day, leaving a hollowed-out shell of a woman who learned to perform the role of the perfect, placid wife with a chilling, Emmy-worthy precision. She smiled at his dinner parties, managed his household with quiet efficiency, and endured his violations in the dark. All the while, a different kind of education was taking place within her soul. She was not just learning to survive her prison, she was learning its anatomy. The household staff, themselves trapped in a more explicit and brutal form of bondage, watched the slow, spiritual death of their young mistress. They saw the shadows under her eyes, the way she flinched when the master entered a room, the careful, practiced emptiness of her smile. They were powerless to intervene, for their own survival depended on a cultivated invisibility. All except for one, Marmon Joel. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence in the slave quarters. She had been with the Dilroy family longer than most of the gravestones in their private, iron-fenced cemetery. Her back was curved by time and endless labor, her hands thickened and scarred by decades of service in the very kitchens that fed the master's insatiable gluttony. Her face was a roadmap of a hard-lived life, but her eyes were the feature that arrested anyone who dared to meet her gaze. They were dark, intelligent, and held a depth of knowledge that was unsettling. They were sharp and patient, like the eyes of a predator that knows it can outweight any prey. Maman Joel had seen it all. She had, as the story was whispered, nursed Edmund as a colicky infant, teaching him to suckle. She had tasted his fists as a grown woman when a meal was not to his liking. And now, in her old age, she stirred his stews and baked his bread with a dead-eye patience that was more terrifying than any open rebellion. She knew pain not as a singular event, but as a language, a constant, droning companion she had long ago mastered. She was a library of the Dilroy family's sins. In the sweltering dinkus, humed stillness of the kitchen, far from Edmund's drunken rampages and Lucille's forced smiles, an unlikely, unspoken sanctuary formed. Joel would watch the young mistress drift into her domain, bruised in spirit if not always in flesh, and would simply gesture to a small wooden stool by the hearth. She offered no words of comfort. They both knew words were useless against a man like Edmund. Empty platitudes were an insult to the reality of their suffering. Instead, Joel offered Lucille something far more valuable, the profound, healing dignity of being seen. Night after night, this silent communion became a ritual. Lucille would sit, sometimes for hours, learning to breathe again to the steady. Rhythmic sounds of Joel's world, the sharp chop of a knife through vegetables, the soft thud of dough being kneaded against a floured board, the gentle hiss and bubble of a simmering pot, surrounded by the earthy smells of herbs, roasting meats, and baking bread. Lucille felt a part of her soul, long dormant, slowly begin to stir. It was here, in the one place where the master's presence felt diluted, that the first portents of the future began to gather like storm clouds on a distant horizon. There was no grand plan yet, no whispered conspiracy. There was only a shared gaze over a flickering candle, a silent acknowledgement of a massive, unpayable debt that the world had no intention of ever collecting. It was a gaze from an old woman that said, "I see your suffering. Child, it is a story I know by heart." And it was a gaze from a young woman that replied, for the first time, not with fear, but with a flicker of something else, something hard and cold. "I know you see mine. This unspoken pact, this quiet weaving of two distinct agonies into a single, unbreakable thread of understanding, was the first and most crucial ingredient in the terrifying recipe of what was to come. That silent, shared understanding in the flickering firelight of the kitchen did not immediately bloom into a fully formed conspiracy. It lay dormant, a single, potent seed planted in the fertile ground of shared suffering, waiting for the precise catalyst to make it grow. For months, the oppressive rhythm of the plantation continued unchanged. A veneer of normalcy stretched thin over a foundation of simmering hatred. The catalyst arrived on a sweltering evening in late August, during one of Edmund Dilroy's infamous dinner parties, an event designed less for hospitality and more for the public performance of his own grandiosity. The air in the grand dining room was thick with the scent of roasted duck, beeswax from the dozens of candles, and the cloying perfume of the parish's elite. The conversation was a brittle, polite murmur, a delicate dance of veiled insults and strategic flattery. Edmund, seated at the head of the long mahogany table, was in his element. He was 3 glasses deep into his finest French brandy, his face flushed with arrogance, his voice booming as he held court. Lucille, seated at the opposite end, was a vision of elegance and passivity, a perfect hostess, her smile a beautiful, meticulously maintained lie. He made a joke at her expense, a crude remark about her family's finances veiled in the thinnest layer of courtly language. It was a familiar cruelty, one she had weathered 100 times before. But tonight, something was different. She did not offer the customary self-deprecating laugh. She did not lower her eyes in practiced submission. She simply looked at him, her gaze clear and steady, her face a mask of serene indifference. In her eyes, for the first time, he saw not a reflection of his own power, but a void, an emptiness where her fear should have been, and it enraged him. The sudden silence from the head of the table caused the polite chatter to falter and die. Every eye turned to them. In that moment, Edmund felt his authority challenged not by an act of rebellion, but by an absence of the fear he demanded. He rose from his chair, his bulk casting a long shadow down the table. He strode the length of the room, his boots echoing on the polished floor. And then, in front of the judges, the bankers, and their perfumed wives, he struck her. The sound of his open palm cracking against a cheek was not loud, but it was absolute. It was a sonic tear in the fabric of the evening, a noise so vulgar and raw that it silenced everything. The clinking of silverware stopped. A collective, horrified breath was drawn in and held. Humiliation, stark and brutal, hung in the air. Lucille did not cry out. She did not stumble. She simply stood, her head turned slightly from the force of the blow, a vivid red mark blossoming on her pale skin like a brand. For a long, stretched moment, she remained perfectly still. Then, with a grace that was terrifying in its deliberation, she turned, not to her chambers to weep, but away from the stunned audience, and walked out of the dining room. Her steps were not hurried. They were measured, calm, and purposeful. Each footfall was a silent declaration, a final, irrevocable departure from the woman she had been forced to be. She walked through the grand foyer, past the gilded mirrors that had for so long reflected her misery, and toward the back of the house, toward the kitchen, toward Joel. When she pushed open the heavy kitchen door, the familiar scent of wood smoke and yeast enveloped her. Maman Joel was at the great wooden table, her hands methodically scouring a large iron pot, her back to the door. She did not need to turn around. She had felt the shift in the house's energy, the shockwave from the dining room. She slowly placed the pot down and turned, her eyes, ancient and knowing, took in the scene before her, the mistress of the house, standing tall, her evening gown shimmering, and the ugly, violent red splayed across her cheek. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The bruise was a confession. The question had been asked and answered 1,000 times over, in their silent glances. But the slap had been the final punctuation, in Joel's eyes. Lucille did not see pity. She saw a verdict. A slow, deliberate nod from the old woman confirmed it. The seed of their shared understanding, watered by this ultimate public degradation, had finally, irrevocably, broken ground. In the months that followed that night, a quiet, almost imperceptible revolution began to brew within the walls of the Dilroy mansion. To any outside observer, life continued as it always had, but beneath the surface of daily routines, a meticulous and deadly plan was taking shape, its patience the most terrifying weapon of all. Lucille, once the fragile phantom of the house, sharpened into a master strategist, cloaked in the disarming guise of politeness and marital devotion. She played the part of the forgiving wife with a newfound, chilling perfection. She nursed Edmund through his increasingly frequent drunken stupors, her touch gentle, her voice soft, all the while counting his heartbeats with the predatory precision of a vulture. Every lavish dinner party she hosted was no longer a trial of endurance, but a reconnaissance mission. Every casual conversation with the parish elite was a way to test loyalties and mask her true intentions. The kitchen, meanwhile, transformed from a place of servitude into a clandestine war room. It was there, one moonless night, long after the main house had fallen silent, that Maman Joel formalized their pact. She gestured for Lucille to sit at the heavy oak table, the same table where she had found solace so many times before, from a loose floorboard beneath the pantry, a space no one but she had known existed. Joel retrieved a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. She unwrapped it slowly. It was a key. It was not the master key for the house, but something far older. Its iron form pitted and dark, its grooves worn smooth from use long before Dilroy arrogance had ever claimed these lands. "It opens the family mausoleum," Joel said, her voice a low rumble, the words hanging in the air with immense weight. She slid the key across the table. It was cold and heavy in Lucille's palm. It was not merely a tool. It was a covenant, a symbol that Edmund's flesh and legacy would not be honored with rest beneath marble and epitaphs. It was the transfer of power over his eternity. With the covenant sealed, Joel began to gather her trusted few. She moved with the quiet wisdom of a spider weaving its web, selecting only those whose souls had been irrevocably scarred by Edmund's whims. There was Samuel, the head stableman, a giant of a man whose gentleness had been shattered years ago when Edmund sold his wife to a trader from Georgia to settle a gambling debt. There was Martha, a house servant whose back was a roadmap of the master's whip, a permanent record of his displeasure over a spilled glass of wine. And there was old Elijah, the groundskeeper, whose tongue had been cut out years prior for the crime of speaking back to the master's son. Joel needed no grand speeches of persuasion. Their pact required no ceremony. Their bodies had already signed it in scars long ago. In the secrecy of the late-night kitchen, plans were whispered over simmering pots and kneaded into bread. The smokehouse, that grim, windowless building behind the kitchens, once a symbol of Edmund's lavish feasts, was chosen to be their altar. And Lucille, the lady of the manor, began to learn recipes not found in any French cookbook, guided by Joel's gnarled hands. She learned about the properties of certain herbs to mask the scent of blood, the right combination of spices from a faraway homeland to purify meat, the precise application of a dark molasses glaze to give a deceptive sheen of sweetness. They were not learning to cook. They were learning the alchemy of reclamation. Their plan was a symphony of patience. They did not rush fate. They simply prepared the stage for Edmund's own undoing. Every bottle of bourbon he swallowed, every violent outburst that left him breathless, every drunken fall down the grand staircase was a note added to the crescendo of his self-destruction. And on the eve of his death, when he finally collapsed in a heap of sweat and bile at the top of the stairs, his heart sputtering its last, Lucille did not scream. She did not summon the doctor. She watched. She waited. She listened until a final, rattling breath had escaped his lungs and dissipated into the humid Louisiana air. Then, and only then, did she approach. She knelt, kissed his cooling forehead with the tenderness of a loving wife, and whispered into his deaf ear, "You have fed off of us for long enough." As tradition dictated, Edmund's body was prepared for burial. He was dressed in his finest linen suit and laid in an ornate coffin carved from imported mahogany, a vessel fit for a king. But that coffin would not find its final rest beneath the family crest. That coffin was a decoy. Lucille, with the cold efficiency of a general, had already ensured the undertaker was bribed, his silence bought with a sum that could secure his retirement. The plantation guards assigned to watch over the body were quietly dismissed with the story of a contagious fever. By the time night fell, blanketing the plantation in an impenetrable darkness, the heavy iron key was already in Joel's hands. Their pact, nurtured in secret for months, had finally ripened. The butcher's knives, honed to a razor's edge, were ready. And Edmund Dilroy, a man who believed his flesh and his name were untouchable, was about to be carried down a path he had never walked in life, toward the heart of his own dominion, to become the centerpiece of a ritual that would break generations of chains. The procession moved without lanterns, guided only by the faint starlight and an intimate knowledge of the land. Samuel and 3 other men, their faces grim masks of purpose, carried the heavy coffin. Their steps were muffled on the dewy grass. This was a path Edmund had never walked, for he believed the smokehouse and the slave quarters to be beneath him. Tonight, his corpse would take every humiliating step. The smokehouse stood at the edge of the service area, a grim, windowless structure of cypress wood, its walls stained black with the smoke of 1,000 cured hams. It was a place of silence, where meats hung from rusted hooks, where the air clung thick with salt and memory. Tonight, it transformed. It was no longer a room of labor. It became a shrine, a dark cathedral, for a reckoning. With a collective grunt, the men heaved the coffin onto the massive, scarred wooden butchering table at the center of the room. The sound of the lid being pried open was a loud groan that seemed to make the very air exhale. In the dim, flickering light of a single, carefully placed lantern, Edmund Dilroy's face was revealed. Death had not softened his features. His lips were still twisted in that arrogant sneer, as if he were sneering at the indignity of his own demise. Maman Joel approached the table, her movements slow, deliberate, sacred. She laid her hand gently on the polished wood of the coffin's edge. "We don't bury demons," she muttered, her voice a low, guttural hum. "We cut them down to size." She unwrapped a long bundle of cloth, revealing her tools. They were not the rough implements of a field worker, but the precise, glistening knives of a butcher, sharpened on stone until their edges seemed to whisper. To her, this was not desecration. It was a holy purification. No prayers were said. No last rites were given. Joel began to hum, a low, melodic hymn that had crossed the ocean in the bellies of slave ships, a song of sorrow and resilience. As she hummed, she made the first incision. It was precise, clean, just beneath Edmund's jawline. The men worked in a quiet, focused rhythm, their faces illuminated in the hellish, dancing light. They were disassembling the tyrant who had once called himself their master. They were unmaking a man. Each cut was an act of reclaiming, each slice a removal of power. His flesh, once a symbol of their suffering, of his absolute dominion over their bodies, now filled iron pots, destined to become a dark, bubbling stew, an unholy communion that would alter the very soul of the plantation forever. The work in the smokehouse was completed with a chilling, solemn efficiency as the night deepened towards its darkest point. The fire beneath the great iron pots was fed, and soon a new aroma began to drift out from the grim wooden structure. It was an aroma that defied simple description, a complex tapestry of scent that was paradoxically mouth-watering and deeply revolting. The sharp, earthy smell of herbs and the fiery heat of cayenne pepper mingled with the rich, dark scent of slow-cooked meat and the sweet, smoky perfume of molasses. It was a smell that had never before been created on the Dilroy plantation. It coiled through the humid air, an invisible summons, a fragrant announcement that a new kind of feast was ready. It was not a feast of hunger, but of balance. In the cramped, dimly lit building, that served as the communal eating space for the enslaved. A profound stillness had fallen. There had been no orders, no calls to gather. They had arrived of their own will, drawn one by one from their meager shacks by that potent, unfamiliar scent and something far more powerful, a shared, unspoken understanding that history was about to be irrevocably altered. They stood in silence, their forms packed close together in the oppressive heat, their eyes reflecting the trembling glow of a few oil lamps. At the center of the room, on a makeshift serving table, sat the large iron pot, its contents bubbling softly, its dark surface seeming to absorb the very light around it. Mammon Joel stood beside the pot, her ladle poised like a scepter, her face, carved by time into a mask of stone, betrayed no emotion. There was no need for words. They all knew what boiled within that iron belly. Lucille Dilroy remained just beyond the doorway, a spectral figure in her mourning black, a crystal glass of red wine held delicately in her hand. She was not a participant, but the architect, the high priestess observing a sacred rite she had designed. She watched them, her eyes not filled with pity, nor with triumph, but with a deep, chilling clarity. This was not an act of savagery. This was alchemy. This was reclamation. Joel began to ladle the thick, dark stew into rough wooden bowls. Each movement was slow, deliberate, as if she were baptizing the food with the weight of centuries. The first bowl was handed to Samuel. His hands, though calloused and immensely strong from years of toil, trembled slightly as he accepted the offering. He did not sit. He did not speak. He stood rooted to the ground, raising the spoon to his lips with the gravity of a man about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. The first bite was small, almost hesitant, but as the meat touched his tongue, something shifted deep within him. A long, slow, trembling breath escaped his lips. His shoulders, perpetually hunched in a posture of submission, seemed to relax and straighten. It was not relief. It was recognition. One by one, the bowls were filled and hands extended. Martha, her back a permanent testament to the master's cruelty, accepted her portion with a solemn nod. Elijah, mute but ever watchful, cradled his bowl as if it were a holy relic. Even the children, who had never known freedom but had inherited its absence through their mother's lullabies, partook in the silent communion. Here, in this moment, there was no rank, no hierarchy. They were all equals at this unholy supper. The silence was oppressive, yet it was not empty. It was filled with unspoken words, with the ghosts of violations, with dreams that had been crushed beneath Edmund's boots. Each spoonful carried a weight far heavier than flesh. This was the irrefutable evidence, not for a court of law, but for the court of the soul. They were dismantling the myth of the master, erasing his dominion from within their own bodies, rewriting his legacy in their very veins. This was not cannibalism for hunger. It was consumption of power. But the final act of this terrible communion was yet to be served. The desecrated flesh had nourished the oppressed. Now, it would be used to indict the complicit. Days later, after a sham funeral for an empty coffin, invitations were sent from the Dilroy plantation, handwritten by Lucille herself on the finest cream-colored paper, sealed with black wax bearing the family crest. They summoned every influential name in St. Landry Parish. It was to be a grand affair, a memorial dinner to celebrate the legacy of the late Edmund Dilroy. For years, Lucille had watched these same people, the judges, the bankers, the cotton lords, and their perfumed wives raise their glasses to Edmund's cruelty, laughing at his coarsest jokes, turning a blind eye to his brutality. Tonight, they would raise their forks to him in a more intimate, more permanent way. The plantation house had never looked so immaculate. The chandeliers webbed light onto the polished silver that gleamed like daggers. The long mahogany table was dressed in lace, finer than any cathedral altar, centered with towering vases of white lilies, whose sickly sweet scent masked something far more primal simmering in the kitchen. In that kitchen, Marmonjol commanded her staff with the solemn focus of a general. The prime cuts had been chosen carefully, the tenderloin, the strips of meat once carried on the bones of a man who thought himself untouchable. Joel had marinated the flesh in a reduction of dark molasses, cayenne, and vinegar, a recipe passed through whispers and shackles, designed to transform and conceal. As the carriages arrived, Lucille greeted each guest with the flawless elegance of a grieving hostess. Her smile was soft. Her eyes glistened with fabricated sorrow. But behind that mask, her mind was a cold, sharp instrument, taking a silent tally. These were the people whose complicity had built Edmund's throne. Tonight, that complicity would be served back to them on fine porcelain. By the time the guests were seated, the atmosphere had crystallized into a fragile tension. The death of a man like Edmund was not a tragedy to these people. It was an opportunity for gossip, for subtle shifts in power. Lucille stood and offered a brief, poetic eulogy, speaking of Edmund's unyielding character and his dedication to the prosperity of the land, never once allowing her lips to betray the venom curled beneath each syllable. Then the first course arrived. A hush fell over the table. Marmonjol herself supervised the procession of dishes, ensuring each plate was a mirror of the other thinly sliced meat, caramelized at the edges. Resting atop a bed of roasted root vegetables, drizzled with a rich, dark sauce that glistened like oil under the candlelight. The aroma was overwhelming. The guests, oblivious, began to eat. Lucille watched them, her wineglass untouched. Judge Renaud, a man whose voice had once praised Edmund's firm hand, closed his eyes in pleasure. Exquisite, Madame Dilroy, he murmured, unaware that the flesh dissolving on his tongue had once belonged to the man who had ordered the lashings he so admired. One by one, the chorus of praise began. Delicate, yet robust, said Madame Lafitte. A depth of flavor I've never tasted before, added Monsieur Bechum. Every compliment was a knife driven deeper into the lie. Every forkful was an act of unwitting desecration. Joel remained at the edge of the dining room, a silent, judging shadow. She watched their forks pierce the meat, watched their lips savor the legacy of a man who had never known the humility of his own blood. This was not a confession spoken in words. This was a truth unveiled through a shared, unholy act, a dark sacrament where the sinners feasted upon the very sin they had enabled. As the guests savored the final bites of a terrain crafted from marrow and finer cuts, Lucille stood and raised her glass. To Edmund, she said softly, her voice carrying through the room. May he continue to nourish the prosperity of this land. The words slid through the air like a serpent, coiling around the oblivious diners, who lifted their glasses in a toast, sealing their part in the unholy ritual. The immediate aftermath of the two feasts was not an explosion, but a slow, seeping poison. The first tangible evidence of the truth began to surface not in the grand house, but at the edge of the property, in the cold, silent world of the dead. 2 days after the sham funeral, the undertaker's young apprentice, a boy with more curiosity than sense, was sent to the Dilroy family mausoleum to place a wreath on the sealed door. He returned to his master, pale-faced and stammering, swearing that the heavy iron doors of the tomb had been found slightly ajar. More terrifyingly, the crypt inside was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken locks, just an empty, echoing stone chamber and a silence so thick it felt alive. the undertaker. A man paid well by Lucille to ensure there were no complications, quickly dismissed the boy's claims as fanciful nonsense. But rumors, once birthed, rarely obey commands. By the third day, the whispers in the nearby town of Washington had grown teeth. The story of the empty tomb began to circulate, twisting itself into a ghost story. But it was another piece of evidence that gave the rumors their foul credibility a smell. It wasn't the sharp, intrusive smell of rot, but something more subtle, more insidious. A dense, smoky aroma that drifted from the direction of the slave quarters, tinged with exotic spices and a sweetness that lingered unpleasantly on the tongue. It was a smell that didn't belong to any known Cajun or Creole recipe, yet it was unmistakably of cooked meat. Visitors to the plantation commented on it, their faces tightening as they politely inquired about the kitchen's preparations. Lucille would offer a delicate smile, a soft shrug, and murmur, "Marmon Joel has always been inventive with her stews." Behind that serene facade, she was a meticulous custodian of her secret. She personally supervised the scrubbing of the smokehouse with vinegar and lye until the wooden walls gleamed and the air smelled only of cleaning agents. The butcher's knives were polished and returned to their places. The ashes from the fire pits were scattered across the vast fields, mingling with the earth that had once been drenched with the sweat and blood of those Edmund had tormented. She was purging the physical evidence, but the true evidence could not be scrubbed away. It had been consumed, and now it was beginning to demand a reckoning. The guests who had attended the memorial dinner began to fall ill, not with a common sickness, but with maladies of the soul. Judge Renaud, a man of booming confidence, collapsed in the middle of a court proceeding, clutching his stomach and speaking of a fire in his gut. Madame Lafitte, who had praised the meat's delicacy, developed a violent aversion to all food, claiming it crawled on her plate. Monsieur Besham began to suffer from terrible nightmares, waking his household with screams about being devoured from the inside out. They were isolated incidents, dismissed by doctors as cases of nerves or overindulgence. But to Lucille, listening to the reports that trickled back to her, they were the first societal repercussions. They were the first notes in a long, slow symphony of a curse taking root. The truth had been buried, but it refused to stay dead. The maladies that afflicted the guests of the memorial dinner were merely the first tremors of a much deeper earthquake. The poison, having taken root in the bodies of the complicit, now began to seep outward, into the very land itself. The collapse of the Dilroy legacy was not a swift, clean break, but a slow, agonizing rot, as if the plantation itself were developing a sickness of the soul. The once thriving sugarcane fields, the source of Edmund's immense wealth, began to wither. Their leaves, once a vibrant green, curled inward and turned a brittle, sickly yellow, recoiling from an unseen toxin in the soil. The livestock grew skittish and gaunt. Horses would refuse to approach the stables at night, their eyes wide with terror, while the hunting dogs howled at empty corners of rooms. The very ground seemed to sag. The air grew heavy and stagnant, and the grand mansion, once a symbol of unshakable power, began to exhale an almost palpable aura of decay. At the heart of this creeping dread was the large iron pot from the smokehouse. After the secret feast, Joel had refused to scrub it clean. She had left it in the center of the smokehouse, its belly stained with the dark, greasy residue of Edmund Dilroy's final surrender. When Lucille, a woman of order and precision, questioned her, Joel had only smiled a slow burp, knowing curve of her lips that offered no comfort. "It holds him now," the old woman murmured, her fingers trailing over the pot's rusted surface as if caressing a sleeping child. A body consumed in vengeance is never free. Every bite tethers the soul, piece by piece. That pot is full of anchors. Madame, Lucille, the cool-headed architect of the initial plan, wanted to dismiss these words as the superstitions of an old slave, but the plantation would not let her. The nights grew louder, filled with whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. One evening, she descended into the kitchen to find the staff huddled in a corner, their eyes locked in terror. On the stove, the great iron pot, which should have been in the smokehouse, had been moved. It now sat positioned perfectly atop the cold stove, as if daring someone to light the fire beneath it once more. No one confessed to touching it. Joel stood apart from the others, her arms crossed, her gaze distant. "He's restless," she said flatly. "He was swallowed, but he don't want to settle." Lucille felt a chill spread across her skin, a sensation she had not felt even in the moment she orchestrated her husband's unholy demise. She had planned for revenge, for a final, definitive end. She had not accounted for the afterbirth of that vengeance, the lingering, malevolent spirit that refused to be digested. The true redefinition of the plantation was underway. It was no longer a home, but a haunted vessel. The final horrifying proof of this came one stormy night. The iron pot vanished from the kitchen. A frantic search led by Lucille ended when Joel found it, resting silently atop Edmund's empty crypt in the family mausoleum. The pot was dry, but inside, curled like a question mark, lay a single, bleached white human bone. Joel's voice was barely a whisper against the howling wind. "He wants a body again." In that moment, Lucille understood. The pot had become a womb for his resentment, and now it demanded not just revenge, but a grotesque resurrection. Her control was an illusion. The collapse was total. That night, Lucille made her final strategic decision. She ordered the mausoleum to be sealed with brick and mortar, entombing the cursed pot within. She instructed a now terrified Samuel to burn the smokehouse to the ground, to scatter its ashes far beyond the plantation's borders, and to never speak of it again. The commands were carried out with the somber finality of mourners burying a secret. But as the flames consumed the old wooden structure, a low, almost inaudible hum vibrated up through the soles of their feet from the ground beneath them. They had not cleansed the land. They had only sealed the poison within it. Time, on the Dilroy plantation, began to move differently. Decades passed, but the house and the land seemed trapped in the amber of that one terrible year. Lucille Dilroy remained, a permanent fixture in a crumbling empire. She outlived them all. The judges, the bankers, the perfumed ladies all had withered into oblivion, their names whispered only in scandalous local tales of madness and mysterious ailments. But Lucille endured, the grim warden of her own haunted legacy. Visitors rarely came anymore. Those who did, daring fools or lost travelers, returned to town with the same unsettling stories. They spoke of cold draughts that moved against the wind, of mirrors that seemed to ripple like water, and most disturbingly, of a sound, a soft, rhythmic chewing that seemed to emanate from within the very walls of the house, as if something just beneath the plaster were gnawing its way free. Lucille heard it too. It was the soundtrack to her solitude. In the long, silent nights, she would lie in her grand Antebellum, decaying four-poster bed, and listen to the slow, methodical sound of consumption that had never ceased since the feasts. It was not guilt that haunted her. Lucille had never once regretted her actions. No, What haunted her was the chilling truth of Joel's warning: a body devoured in vengeance never truly rests. The curse had matured. It was no longer a violent, active force, but a permanent, living memory woven into the fabric of the house itself. The plantation had become a womb for the spirit it had created, and Lucille, its unwilling, eternal matron. Marmon Joel had died peacefully in her sleep years earlier, but her lineage and her story remained. Joel's granddaughter, a woman named Abini, would often come to the edge of the estate, never crossing the rusted iron gates, but always watching. She was the new sentinel, the keeper of the oral history, ensuring the truth was not forgotten. The tale of the widow in black and the feast that devoured a man's sins had been reduced to a cautionary hymn, sung in whispers among Joel's descendants. A story told not to scare, but to remind. It was a secret that still lived, breathing just beyond the veil of polite history, on the final night of her life. As the 19th century drew to a close, Lucille lay in her bed. The drapes were moth-eaten, the air thick with the dust of years. The house hummed around her, the walls pulsating with the same chewing rhythm that had been her companion for half a century. She did not fear it. In the dim light of a single candle, she spoke aloud to the empty room, her voice a dry rasp. "I fed them all," she whispered, a statement of fact to the shadows she knew were listening. "And they will never be free." A presence gathered at her bedside. She did not need to open her eyes to know its shape, the subtle cadence of its resentful silence. It was the fragmented, lingering whisper of Edmund. "I outlived you," Lucille murmured, her last breath a final, defiant sigh. "I outlasted your name." When dawn breached the horizon, Lucille Dilroy was gone. Her body lay still, but for the first time in decades, the house was quiet. The townsfolk claimed the mansion exhaled that morning, releasing a great, collective sigh that carried through the cane fields and settled like dew on every doorstep. The story was now complete. But what is the legacy of such a tale when justice is denied by man and law? Does the earth itself seek a more terrible, elemental balance? The act of vengeance was a single bloody night, but its echoes have proven eternal. Lucille had sought to erase Edmund's name, to make him disappear bite by bite, but in doing so, she had inadvertently given him a horrifying immortality, binding him not to a tomb of marble, but to the very bones of the land and the memory of the people. The Dilroy plantation was never reclaimed. It remains a skeleton on the edge of town, a rotting monument to what happens when cruelty is fed back to its maker. It serves as a dark warning, a question left hanging in the humid Louisiana air. Vengeance is never a clean meal. It does not end the story. It traps you within it, forever. And those who walk near the ruins at night, when the wind is still and the moon is hidden, swear they can still hear it. A soft, rhythmic sound, slow and methodical, from deep within the collapsing walls, as if the house itself, unable to forget, is still savoring a meal that will never, ever end.